There is no nightlife in Spain. They stay up late, but they get up late. That's not nightlife. That's delaying the day. Ernest Hemingway. In this video, we will be assessing the current geopolitical power and influence of Spain. While nowhere near as powerful as they were during the 1500s, Spain's influence on the world stage has been historically monumental, and for the past century, unfortunately, greatly overlooked. Now let's start off with geography. Spain is located on the Iberian Peninsula in Europe, which makes it a peninsula on a peninsula, given the Eurasian landmass. Being on the far end of the Eurasian landmass, this gives Spain relative isolation and safety compared to other European countries like Germany and Poland. Its location gives it access to the Mediterranean and Atlantic Ocean. This location would be instrumental in its past massive geopolitical power as a maritime empire, as shown during the 1500s, as well as ability to avoid inter-European conflict over the past few centuries. Spain has a warm Mediterranean climate, which is relatively dry and great for human habitation, at least in parts where it isn't deserts and canyons. This results in fairly dense population growth, and has a lot of pretty vistas. The region also is pretty arid for Europe, but nowhere near as arid as North Africa across the Mediterranean Sea. Much of the country is very hilly, with a series of small-scale river systems without any large unifying rivers to unite the nation. This has led to unofficial decentralization of each region. It is difficult to centralize power and maintain control here. Spain also borders Portugal to the west. What makes this unusual is that there are many sub-regions of Spain that in many ways are more different from central Spain than they are to Portugal. For example, the Spanish language is far more similar to Portuguese than it is to the Basque language in northeastern Spain. This difference in national borders is due to the historical and political matters rather than being the result of some sort of ironclad ethnic or linguistic reason. Spain also borders Andorra and France to the northeast, with a mountain range acting as a barrier which helps halt any long-term invasions between France and Iberia. Spain also holds islands in the Mediterranean and the Canary Islands in the Atlantic. The Canary Islands and the Atlantic acted as Spain's test ground run for colonization in the Americas. And the islands in the Mediterranean have been a concern in modern days given the refugee crisis and the invasion of publicly drunk defecating British tourists. Aside from that, it's a really nice place. You should visit there. Speaking of the British, Spain actually borders the UK, sort of. Gibraltar is a British territory, maintaining a strong British heritage, and it has strategic importance at the mouth end of the Mediterranean and the Atlantic, despite Spanish resentment. Spain also holds enclaves bordering Morocco and North Africa, being fairly disconnected from activities of Morocco. Let's move on to history. I could start at the Stone Age, but I'm lazy, so I'm going to start when the concept of Spain really came into fruition, during the Middle Ages. Throughout much of this time, the Iberian Peninsula was under Muslim rule. Arab armies, along with Berbers from North Africa, had conquered much of what is now Spain, halting at the border of what is now France due to Charles the Hammer. Much of the country converted to Islam, but the north remained Christian. By this time, the Islamic world was far more advanced in science, technology, medicine, and artistic endeavors than much of Western Europe. Eventually, the kingdoms of Castile and Aragon would unite to create Spain and fight the Muslims, with the aid of Portugal. Aragon would maintain its own separate language, morphing into Catalan, and Portugal maintained its independence altogether, except for a relatively brief union. The Spanish you hear today is Castilian Spanish, since the region played the dominant role in uniting the country against the Muslims, and has continued to dominate the scene, even though there's some significant portion of decentralization. The Christians eventually kicked out the Muslims and Jews from Catholic Spain, essentially kicking out most of the educated people. This resulted in the Spanish Inquisition, a period of Catholic fanaticism, which would persecute heretics and religious minorities, as well as to ensure that Spain's technological advances would be stifled, as that of England, France, and later the Netherlands and Germany would surpass them in science and engineering. Around this time, the Spanish crown hired Genoese sailor Christopher Columbus to set up trade routes in Asia, but he ended up making contact with the New World that same year. With the Muslims defeated, the Spanish Empire in the New World eventually took up the Caribbean and, with the help of some guns, germs, and steel, swiftly defeated the Aztecs in what is now Mexico. The Incans were taken over in what is now Peru. From Colorado to the southern tip of Chile, the Spanish Empire was particularly brutal to the indigenous peoples, forcing the natives to convert to Christianity, setting up the encomienda system, which was highly hierarchical and a system of forced labor on plantations. They also used them to extract gold and silver. Spain became extremely wealthy, flooding the market with gold and silver, leading to hyperinflation and crashing the economy. They spent much of that money fighting Protestants in Europe rather than improving the lives of their own populace. Despite this dark history, it's worth pointing out that Latin American culture emerged out of a lot of these horrors and is a beautiful and rich culture to this day. I know it's controversial saying this in this current cultural zeitgeist, but it's important to note that history is very complex. So let's move on. Eventually, Spain's glory days would come to an end as the Spanish Armada would be destroyed in a storm on their way to attack Protestant England. If only the Catholic God wasn't taking his nap break. The Spanish monarchy would eventually intermarry with the Habsburgs, who were also Catholic, from what is now Hungary. They would fight Protestant kingdoms among others, eventually losing grasp of their continental power. By the time Napoleon came around, Spain lost most of its great power status and became a relatively small player compared to France, Britain, Prussia, Austria-Hungary, and Russia. Seeing how much weaker Spain was, most of its colonies in Latin America fought for independence, as the ethnic white Spanish Creoles who were born in the Americas resented the second-class citizen status to native Spaniards, and this was also fueled by the American and French revolutions. The collapse of the Spanish Empire would be finalized in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, as Spain would lose a war with the United States, giving up the Philippines, Cuba, and Puerto Rico, and pretty much showing the world that Spain was no longer a power to be taken seriously, while the US certainly was. It was humiliating seeing this great former power being brought to its knees by what was oftentimes considered a rebellious upstart nation like the US. Spain would eventually stay neutral during World War I, something rather easy to do given its geopolitical location and isolation. But peace would not last long, as the Spanish Civil War broke out between the fascist Franco, backed up by fascist Italy and Germany, and the Republican Army backed up by the Soviet Union. Liberal democracies pretty much stayed neutral. However, the Soviet Union would back the Spanish Republic, which eventually lost. Franco won, but despite being supported by Italy and Germany, he stayed neutral during World War II, escaping much of the devastation. Again, thankfully due to their geographic isolation on the European continent. During the Cold War, the US loosened its distaste for Franco, as he was anti-communist. Spain would eventually democratize after Franco's death and would join the military alliance NATO as well as the European Union. By the late 2000s, Spain would also experience massive economic difficulties. Speaking of recessions, let's move on to the economy. Spain's economy is a mixed bag. On one hand, it's a developed nation with a high standard of living, ranking very high when it comes to GDP per capita and its Human Development Index, yet it suffers from high unemployment rates. It also has a high debt to GDP ratio and has periodic economic instability. During the Great Recession, Spain's unemployment rate grew to a staggering 25%, and the youth unemployment rate was as high as over 40%. But even in times of economic calm, the unemployment rate can even be around 10%, far higher than the typical 2 to 3% that most developed nations would expect. These problems have caused Spain to join the PIGS countries, which stands for Portugal, Italy, Ireland, Greece, and Spain, a group of mostly Southern European nations that struggle with their finances considerably more than their Northern European counterparts. This has been a recurring stereotype in the eyes of people of Northern Europe that Southern Europeans are oftentimes seen as lazy. I didn't make up the story, I didn't make up the stereotype, they did. Blame them. While Spain does have more lax work ethics than, say, Germany, it also has strong industries related to tourism, agriculture, metallurgy, automobiles, and pharmaceuticals. The country is also a significant agropower, being one of the largest producers of olive oil and one of the largest producers of grapes, wine, citrus fruit, cured meats, and other foodstuffs. They have a modest industrial base as well, and a creative class. Spain's soft power is also renowned, as it brings more tourists per year than any other country aside from France. Spain also heavily benefits from being part of the EU, as it can export its goods and services to its neighbors without tariffs. Moving on to its governance. Spain's government is unitary-ish. While their constitution doesn't outright encode the power of legal governments explicitly on the regional level, its government in practice is more decentralized, as with those of more officially federal governments such as the US, Canada, and Brazil. Under the Franco dictatorship, minority languages and self-governance was repressed. Ever since then, the country has transitioned into a democracy. Spain has given a great deal of power to regional governments, oftentimes those with separatist tendencies, in order to prevent more drama. This is part of the reason why Madrid is located literally in the middle of the country to maintain central control, while still respecting the quasi-autonomy of regional areas that don't share its same culture and language. The most tenuous of which is, of course, the region of Catalonia and the Basque Country. Catalonia is home of Barcelona. It is the wealthiest part of the country and speaks another Romance language called Catalan. Some separatists view the central government with resentment and consider the rest of the country as outsiders, leeching over Catalonia's wealth. Whether it will separate anytime soon is still up for debate. Another region is the Basque Country. The Basques speak a language that is pre-Indo-European. In fact, it might just be the only language that is pre-Indo-European. While the Basques in France have had their language and culture subjugated by Paris, Madrid has been relatively more tolerant. In the past, there were a number of separatists that had engaged in violence. However, these have died down in recent years. Putting regions aside, Spain's society does face a number of demographic challenges, namely its aging population and its struggle to assimilate immigrants. Given its proximity to Africa, it tends to get a lot of undocumented immigrants from northern African nations. And this has by and large been an issue for a country that has been well known for resisting Islamic expansion. Granted, the country has had more success in assimilating immigrants from Latin America, which leads us to our next topic, foreign affairs. The country has a fairly close set of relations with most Latin American former colonies, as centuries have healed wounds, and many Latin Americans look to Spain as a model for productivity and standardization. Due to its location on the far western side of Europe, Spain doesn't really have to deal with a substantial fear of Russian belligerence. This safe location has allowed it to focus on other matters like building up businesses and a naval presence in West Africa. Its integration with the European Union and NATO means that it no longer has to fear bloody conflicts with its neighbors like France and Portugal. And besides, even if the current European order did collapse, its relative isolation and highly mountainous borders protect it. Relations between Spain and its neighbors like France and Portugal used to be pretty rough and oftentimes bloody, but since then, after World War II, they've been peaceful and prosperous. Spain also not only has close relations with other European nations, but also with the United States. After all, the Spanish-American War ended well over a century ago, and they're pretty friendly now. The Franco regime was anti-communist during the Cold War, and Spain continues to be a noticeable partner in many US-led military interventions. And there, generally speaking, has been a positive set of relations with other US allies. At the end of the day, Spain is oftentimes considered to be a has-been power. Spain's clout is likely to remain stationary, either diminishing in relative terms or drastically receding. But at the end of the day, I think it's probably more likely to just stay stationary. Blessed by the hills and the relative safety of its geographic location, I doubt the country has much to worry about, even if the European order falls apart. But at the same time, Spain's clout pales in comparison to that of the UK, France, Germany, and even Italy. But hey, who needs global power when you're living in a state of eternal nightlife?